Well, cool.
Mhm.
Yeah, I mean, so, welcome everyone to the first ever lunch break talk with Rebekah Goldstein.
Hi.
She's an artist based in the Bay Area, and I'm just going to read a little intro about her. So, Rebekah Goldstein makes paintings that explore color, form, and structure and their relationship to the human body and the built environment. Goldstein currently has a survey of her work at Rosenbaum Contemporary in Boca Raton, Florida, and an upcoming solo show at Denny Gallery in New York. New York City.
Ooh.
Um, Goldstein has shown widely across the Bay Area, including venues such as Cult, Amy Freeberg exhibitions, Contemporary Jewish Museum, Guerrero Gallery, Eleanor Harwood Gallery, Berkeley Art Center, and Bedford Gallery. She has been awarded residencies at the Sam and Adele Golden Center for the Arts and the Atlantic Center for the Arts and the Arad Arts Project. Her work is part of the permanent collection at the Berkeley Art Museum and Pacific Film Archive, McAvoy Foundation of the Arts, the Fidelity Collection, Google, as well as many other notable collections. Her work has been featured in Artforum, Artplugged, Square Cylinder, and New American Paintings. Goldstein received an MFA from California College of the Arts in 2012, which is how we know each other, and a BA from Sarah Lawrence in 2004. Rebekah lives and works in San Francisco. So yeah, I thought to just like kick things off, we could just talk about you're in your studio right now for those who are listening only, but what are you working on now? Like what's the state of the union in your
Yeah, so
studio?
it's like right now everything in my studio is in progress, which is kind of my favorite place to be when like I have
Awesome.
a whole new body of paintings. I'm working on I like keep looking over my shoulder as if they're gonna like chime in and say something.
Yeah, they're like, oh, I got things
Yeah,
to
oh.
say.
I've been doing in the shaped paintings, I've started doing multiples of shapes. So
Hmm.
like rather than having like each painting, so having like multiple the same shape across multiple paintings.
Oh, I see. Instead of
Um,
doing a totally different shape, but it's a
yeah,
different
yeah,
painting.
but
Oh,
it'll
that's
be like a
interesting.
completely different painting, but the same shape.
Oh, I love
Um,
that.
yeah, which has been a really interesting way to work. And
Hmm.
it's funny because um, the shape of the painting seems to dictate so much of what the imagery is going to be. But then
Yeah.
it's really interesting to see how like I'm having like two very different paintings that are like, having very different resolutions, despite the fact that they have the same like shape.
Well, and it's interesting because I always forget that you can kind of make the same painting again, or,
Yes.
and I
Yeah.
think you do work in series, but like
Yeah.
I love this idea of not having to reinvent the wheel completely in
Yeah.
every aspect of your work for every single painting, which
Yes.
it feels
Yeah.
like cheating, but I'm like, so
But
many
then I'm like, no,
artists
it's
do
actually
it.
like really not at all. And I was like, oh my God, how am I going to think of like more shapes? And it was like, oh, I don't like
There's only so many shapes in this
there's
world.
only so many shapes I could think of. Yeah. And it was kind of like, oh, it would be really interesting to see the same shape um, over and over. And I was thinking about like Andy Warhol's shadows, like that
Oh,
big
interesting.
installation where it's like, it's a very he has like two compositions, but it's repeated
Hmm.
over and over through like different color combinations. Um,
Oh, cool. I am not
yeah.
familiar with that actually. Would that be one of his like prints or
Yeah, they're I think they're silk screens, but they're painted on as well.
right?
Yeah,
And they're just of shadows or
yeah. So they're super abstract.
oh, that's so interesting. Well, he's definitely the king of repetition and
Yeah, yeah. And
um
there was I think it was gosh, I don't remember what year it was. They were all up in like maybe like 2015 at the Mocha in LA.
oh, cool.
Yeah.
Okay.
Um, and it was just like a gigantic room, just like lined with, and they were like installed so they were touching. Um,
Oh, nice. Yeah,
yeah,
I
it'd be
feel
like
like I saw he had a retrospective, maybe even at the
yeah,
SF MoMA, where it was like they got a number of his like silver screen paintings where I don't know if it was like Elvis or there was some other thing, and there were so many of them all next to each other. And I felt like
yeah,
that was the best way to see his work because it's so much about that kind of like
yeah,
the still, the film still kind of
yeah,
like, and
absolutely.
then watching how each one shifts and
Yeah. And I feel like I could repeat in like the rectangular paintings. I feel totally fine with like repeating a shape or a form across a
Yeah.
painting. So why not have that repeat for the structure of the painting itself?
Yeah. Well, and even like writers, as you were saying that, like writers do that all the time,
All the
like
time. Yeah.
they like pull from themselves to
Yeah.
like,
Yes. Yeah. So I'm all about kind of, yeah, I've been thinking a lot about repetition. And
oh,
I've
that's
also
cool.
started doing some rectangular paintings again,
Oh, wow.
which has been really exciting. And for a while after doing the shaped paintings, or while doing the shaped paintings initially, I was like, I don't think I could do a rectangular painting again. It would feel so like limiting.
Hmm.
And I was really interested to see that it actually felt the opposite. It feels really expansive.
Mm,
Um, and, while the because the shaped ones are so like the form is so specific, and because the image feels like it needs to respond to the form,
yeah.
on the rectangular ones, it feels like I could paint anything.
Right.
And
And
that feels
maybe
really
you could,
exciting.
no, I'm sure. Like, could
Yeah.
you maybe just share for people who aren't familiar
Yeah.
why you started doing the shaped work and then
Yeah.
how you're thinking
Yeah.
about it now?
So I started doing shaped paintings in 2017, and I had just had my first child. And I think there was something just like the shift of having a kid and having my life change so completely. I think the idea of shaped paintings had been kind of on the back burner in my mind in a while. And I had been making sculptures that sort of looked like um, objects pulled from my paintings.
Hmm.
So I was thinking about moving back and forth between like 3 and 2 dimensions and the transformations that happen. And I had been curious about like what was maybe the space in between the sculpture and the rectangular painting. Um,
But then I
and
think you've said, I don't want to like
then,
speak for you, but you've
yeah,
also said something about how your own
well,
body
yeah. And then, so that had
transformed.
kind of been in the back burner. And then once I had, once Sadie was born, it was like this kind of like, I can't make a square painting. I just needed something completely like different. And I think like, it just felt like after, like 9 months of like pregnancy and my own body transforming and like all the kind of transformation that happens with like having a kid and childbirth, it just felt like the rectangular canvas was not making sense to me anymore. And I needed to see sort of like this shift and metamorphosis in the paintings themselves. And I needed each painting to kind of take its own specific form and be its own specific shape.
Yeah, like I think, if you are going to draw a parallel between the traditional canvas shape and like the human body, it's like it's fine to have the one shape your entire life if you're not like, for example, if you're a man, like your body isn't going to change as
Yeah.
much as like a woman's
Yeah.
giving birth, and so
Yeah.
it like I love this analogy between like the female form going through the stages of pregnancy and like
Yeah.
literally expanding and contracting the sides of the painting to kind of mimic that like alteration that happens. And
Yeah.
you
And kind of just like that, like the particularities and like specificness of form.
yeah, like it's
Um,
awkward and I'm sure
yeah.
like I've heard uncomfortable and
Yes. Yeah. And then later I was thinking about, and like after I had um my kids, and I would bring both of my I have 2 kids now, and I would bring both of them as like babies and infants to the studio with me, and I would paint with them like kind of like in the baby carrier, like strapped to
oh
me.
wow, yeah, that's wild.
Um and I was kind of thinking about, all of a sudden there became this sort of like metaphor of like my body as the armature, like for
Mhm.
another human being. Um,
Yeah.
and like I was almost thinking about like, because like my son liked to sleep like super tightly, like wrapped to me, almost like my body like the stretcher bar and like him like the canvas, or just like this kind of like idea of wrapping and like the body as an armature. Um,
Yeah, we were gonna talk about this later, but I actually think it's more relevant now. Like, this idea of like a force majeure or like, some kind of act of
Yeah.
God, like happening in your life and
Yeah.
just totally transforming your work, which
Yeah.
I think has happened for you. I think it kind of happens for me every like 5 years or
Yeah.
so. Whether or not I choose it. And just this idea that an artist's career is so many things so to expect an artist to do like the one thing
Yeah.
without regard for like external forces acting upon their studio practice is so unrealistic. I don't know if you can
Yeah.
speak to that at all. Like, it seems like you're doing fine,
Yeah.
with transitioning into new work, and maybe we're more accepting now, but I don't know, do you feel like your vision of what you expect for your work and yourself has changed since like grad school around that idea of
Um,
like what the market demand will allow and like what
yeah. I
you need
mean,
to do to fit as an
yeah.
artist?
I guess I think, like the shape paintings was kind of by far the most drastic shift that I've had in my work. And I didn't, I knew it was like a drastic shift, but I didn't really think, I guess I hadn't really thought about it as like, I hadn't really, I like it made so much sense to me. And
Yeah,
it seemed so logical over like looking at my work over a long period of time and like
me
the work
too.
I had been making, that it seemed like it was just sort of part of this trajectory. Like it definitely felt very like new and fresh and exciting, and it still does. But I hadn't been like, oh, I'm making like totally different work now, as if I had like switched to like video or something. Um,
Yeah, no, that makes sense.
but
I do agree that
but I
it
do
feels
think that like
rational.
um other people viewed it that way.
Oh, that
And
did.
um it, you know, I think like the shaped paintings, just like from a market perspective, are much harder to sell. And I think like
Mm,
there's always like market wise, when you do something different, it takes sort of either like your collectors or the market a little while to like catch up with whatever the shift was. And I hadn't really thought about that. And I think it's good that that's not what I'm thinking about in the studio,
totally.
like considering when I'm making work. But yeah, that was like definitely like an unforeseen not consequence, but like,
Yeah.
yeah,
Oh, that's so interesting. Yeah, I wouldn't have guessed it. I almost would have thought they would do better because they're so they're like more conceptual than your
yeah,
rectangular pieces, and they reflected this like really special time in your life, that to me that's very meaningful. But I mean, I guess I'm not thinking like, the average collector or
yeah,
whoever, and um that's interesting.
yeah. Um,
And now thinking about moving back towards like, or having more openness about like, oh, I can work on a rectangle.
yeah,
And, what has that shift been like for you in terms of like, what it means to work in that format versus the shaped pieces?
yeah. I have both going on in the studio now, and it's really kind of fun to go back and forth. I feel like it definitely feels, I think like it was so kind of like at first trying to figure out how to make the shaped canvases. Like it just like took all of my attention to like figure out how I was going to deal with this form. And now
Yeah.
that I sort of have like some strategies under my belt, I could switch gears, because it really does feel like kind of like switching a mind space and how I'm dealing
Yeah. I could see
with
that.
them
Also, shout
spatially.
out to your stretcher bar guy.
Oh yes, I have an amazing stretcher bar guy named Charlie who's like, yeah, I can build anything you want.
Yeah.
um, it feels like, um, like it feel the the rectangular ones feel much more um like I said, kind of like I could paint anything on them. Like if I wanted to just like paint a traditional landscape on the same sized, on the same size stretcher bar, I could. So it's like, how do I fit this imagery into this form? And I think in some ways it has made me like think about the edges of the rectangular, the
Mm,
like the edges of the rectangle more, even though I was always kind of interested in like the image, like pushing and pulling up against the edge. I feel that
yeah. That
in
actually makes
like,
sense. Like you're
yeah,
now aware of it as an object in a way that maybe you took
yeah,
for granted or
yeah,
something.
even, yeah, it's like, oh,
Mm,
like the image really needs to like somehow like include the form of the stretcher bar and like push up against it and like I mean I feel like less of a, maybe more like before, where it felt like maybe the painting was like a smaller section of a wider expanse. Now
mm,
it feels like everything that is like going on is happening within the frame, and there's like no sort of like things pushing off the frame. Like
mm.
everything is contained in the rectangle.
Oh, that's cool. And do
Yeah.
you feel like that relates to your body in a way, or is that maybe like a
Oh,
new
that's a really good
exploration?
question. Um, I don't know if it like relates to my body as much as like my mental space, that like when I'm
Mm,
in the studio, because like the time is generally short, I like feel like I have to be like so super
mm,
focused. Like I try and turn my phone off. Like I try and just
yeah.
like I'm not doing emails. Like I'm just like here in the studio, and like everything that's happening needs to like take place now. So maybe that has to do with the
That makes sense. Yeah,
mhm,
like that's your headspace, and then the not to like
yeah,
make you lock down a meeting around it, but then
yeah,
the other pieces are more about your kind of shifting relationship to your body and,
yeah.
you know.
Um
I do feel like your paintings in the past, before you started working on the shaped canvases, were kind of about this like mental, this like conversation you were having with yourself or people or songs. And it was all very like kind of energetic and cerebral.
yeah.
Does that feel right to you?
I really like that. I really like that description. Energetic and cerebral. I like that.
Yeah, like
Yeah.
it was all kind of going on inside you,
Yeah.
and we were kind of given like a window into it.
Yeah.
And sometimes there were people in there, but in the way that there would be a thought, you know, not something
Yeah.
that was like really obvious.
I think like, and I think the shape paintings were maybe an attempt to like want the painting to be more specific and direct. Like
Mm,
I think they are more specific and direct, like this, and they feel more object like in a
yeah,
way. Like
oh, for sure.
um I think just formally in the other rectangular ones, there was this like push and pull between like figure and ground. And I think people saw really different things in the painting depending on like how they were viewing like that figure ground interaction. And I
Right.
think because in the shaped paintings, there's less of that because it feels like this like kind of specific direct object, and it's harder to kind of have like, even though people are going to interpret it differently, like there's something undeniable about this shape and this thing.
Yeah.
And I think maybe I'm searching for a similar directness in the
In the,
rectangular ones now too. Even though the rectangular ones, it does feel like there's maybe more. I think the I think the shaped ones will always feel more like an object, and the rectangular ones will always feel more like a traditional kind of like illusionistic space. And
yeah. I think it's hard to get around that, even if
yeah,
you're making the most
yeah,
like abstract pieces, you know, or like, you know, kind of minimalist where they're supposed to reflect your body in some way.
yeah,
But I think even so, like just hanging a rectangle on the wall, it's hard to get around that.
yeah,
Not that you should,
yeah,
like that
yeah.
is part of the meaning, I
It's
guess.
part, yeah, it's like kind of part of it kind of comes with the territory, you know?
Yeah. Well, I wanted to make sure we had a chance to talk about the painting salon,
Yeah.
because and it was no, you know, accident or like it wasn't, it was on purpose that I wanted you to be the first guest. Oh,
Oh.
we have it. Nikki Nolan's coming in. Because you were such a big part of like my post grad like social activities. Is
Yeah.
you hosted this lecture series out of your living room, and then in like a couple of years later I took it over, and then
Mhm.
had help of other people, and then I handed it off. So maybe you can just talk about like the impetus for it and what it was in its like first iteration. And
Yeah. So the summer after I graduated from the MFA program, after like a series of feeling like rejections from like applications and things I had applied for, I felt like I felt like I needed to somehow like take initiative and not be looking for other people's like approval to
oh my God, that is huge. Yeah,
yes,
that
like
is a hundred
somehow like
percent
not
like,
being I needed to do something that didn't take somebody else being like, you're a good enough artist, or like, yes, you deserve this award. Like that I
totally.
wanted to create something by myself and with like the people who were around me, whose work that I loved, and that it didn't need to be something like I applied for, you know?
Yeah.
And I also felt like by the time when I graduated, I was feeling like I was just sort of getting my feet under me in terms of like the work I wanted to be making and the conversations that I wanted to be having about my work. And I felt like a lot of my peers sort of felt similarly, and like these conversations and relationships and like artistic conversations were just getting started, and it felt sort of like it felt more like a beginning than an end. And I
Yeah, like you
wanted
only know how to talk about your work once you leave grad school, because
yes.
grad school, you're like, I don't know my ass from my elbow. So how do I
Yeah.
talk about my
You
work,
have yeah, like I had no idea how to talk about my work in grad school, and I don't think anybody really does know how to
It's
talk
not
about
enough
the work.
time.
Yeah, it's not enough time. You're making so much work.
Yeah,
You're There's just so much going on that you don't have enough time to kind of like sit with your work and think about
absolutely.
what it's about. And I think there's also so much like pressure to talk about your work in certain ways, or it's just like it ends up feeling like directed because of other conversations that are going on. So I also just wanted like a space for people to like talk about their work like honestly and maybe a little more casually than
Yeah.
or a lot more casually than like we would if there was a critique going on. Like what is like the actual things that you're thinking about when you're in your studio. um I had actually also like right after grad school I did an artist residency program at the Atlantic Center for the Arts, and it was just like there were 8 other painters there, and there was just such a great vibe there.
And
And
Joanne Greenbaum
it was
was
with
the,
Joan,
yeah, I
yeah, it was
remember
with
that.
Joanne
Yeah.
Greenbaum. And I just found it so easy to like talk about my work in like a completely different way than I had been in grad school. Um, and I was like, oh, I feel like I need to just like actually like be more honest about what I'm thinking about when I'm in the
Yeah.
studio. So anyway, so with all that in mind, I just decided to do like a monthly um kind of like salon style meeting in my living room where we set up a projector and 2 people would present their work, and there was just like wine and snacks, and I invited the people that like kind of like the cohort of um, from like our MFA program and other artists that I knew from the Bay Area, and 2 people would present their work and we would just like talk and hang out. And I remember the first painting salon, some people like stayed over after, and we just like hung out in like my living room and like drank wine till 2 in the morning and like talked about art and life. And it was just such a like amazing it was just such an amazing night, and I was like, oh my god, I want to do this like all the time.
Yeah.
So and I feel like that was kind of everyone's experience, especially at first from the painting salon, was like, oh my gosh,
For
this
sure.
is so much fun, like I want to have these conversations all the time. um
Well, and I think there's something to also, I mean, not to be so careerist about it, but like there's different ways to kind of develop a career and a community for yourself. And like one
yeah,
of them is to kind of do the thing you didn't do, which is like align yourself with people who are more established and
yeah,
chase after something that you see as above you. And
yeah,
the other one that I feel like has worked better for me, and that I feel like that you kind of showed me, like proof is in the pudding, you like create your own community from the people around you, and like
Yeah.
you elevate their voices and give them a chance to inform each other and help each other and kind of bring everyone up at the same
Yeah.
time. And I think that's one of the really strong things that happened kind of as a side effect of your project, is like
Yeah.
we all got to hear how each other spoke about our work, and it's kind of this like, I learned how to like give a good presentation. It took me a while, but
Yeah.
after watching so many, and it also made me feel like, oh yeah, like we're all of our voices are important. It's not just like the
Yeah.
person showing at the big gallery or whatever.
Yeah, I'm so glad that you yeah, I'm so glad that you brought that up, because I do feel like those are two like different ways of functioning, and like one's no better than the other. But I feel like the salon is certainly more comfortable for me, and
Right.
how I
Very cozy.
yeah. And I think there is like um I think shows came out of the painting salon, just by
Right.
like artists getting together, and like there were people who, were curating and had their own project spaces, and people who, went on to have their own galleries.
Yeah.
Um,
And
and
then people who are now like showing at a blue chip gallery, working at a blue chip gallery,
yeah,
so it's
exactly.
like
Yeah.
we're
I
about
think,
10 years out from that, and people have
yeah,
like
people have
fully blown up
definitely,
in
yeah,
there.
people's careers have taken off and blossomed. And I think it's, I
But
think
it's
there's
been nice
something,
to know people in that context, I think.
yeah, exactly. I mean, and I think like it's always so much, as an artist who's 10 years out of grad school, it's so nice to be able to have genuine friendships with people who are like at a different point in their career, and like have
Mhm.
that be genuine when you're like asking them for like a reference or a, whatever.
Yeah,
And
or like
from a,
advice about
yeah,
something,
advice
or
or whatever
yeah,
it is, and like have them, yeah, and have that come from a place of actual friendship than just kind of being like, I don't know.
who are you? Yeah.
Yeah. Um,
Yeah. No, I love that. And I think there is something too, back to like the idea of like lifting people up. It's like you're creating a scene. And I feel like, collectors, writers, whatever, like really respond to like this collective energy. And by giving people a platform, whether it's through like an artist run space or a lecture series, like you're creating a community that I think people become attracted to. And then, maybe more established spaces will be like, oh, we see that
yeah.
person working in this like kind of incubation period with
Yeah.
all these other people. But I think that's like more attractive than if everyone were kind of like working on their own and
Oh,
not,
absolutely. It creates like an
like,
energy. It creates like a, yeah, it creates an energy and excitement.
and I feel like they say that about the punk show, like the first punk show,
Yeah.
people went home and created 10 bands,
Yeah.
like 10 different bands. Like I feel like, after a year of the painting salon, there were like 10 new artist spaces,
Yeah.
artist run spaces, or, so
Yeah. Wow, that's cool to, I mean, it did feel like a really
just like a
exciting,
punk show
yeah,
in your living room.
it it was kind of punk. Um, yeah, I mean, it did, like thinking back, it's hard to know, like it feels like that was kind of like an exciting time. And it doesn't, I don't know if it was just because like I was right out of grad school, so it felt like there were like a lot of opportunities and things popping up, or if objectively it was
I
so,
think
but
it was kind of before it really became prohibitively expensive,
yeah.
where there were spaces and more accessible housing.
Yeah.
Whereas I feel like, yeah, it kind of just kept dropping off, like, and
Yeah.
then people started moving away.
Yeah.
But I
Yeah.
feel like there was a critical mass, like I've said this before on a different show podcast, but like 2016, MSB opened, there
Yeah.
were all these artist run spaces. There was like,
It
the
felt, yeah.
Wattis did a big Laura Owens show, the SF MoMA reopened, there was all this promise. And
Yeah.
then it just like the city itself like couldn't sustain the people who wanted to be cultural producers in the
Yeah.
way that, like every tier of cultural production versus like someone who like finds a gallery and is able to like maintain through that, or,
Yeah.
but we don't
Yeah.
have to go into that sad story.
Yeah.
And we're talking about San Francisco.
Yeah.
I realized maybe we didn't.
Yeah. We're in San Francisco.
Yeah,
Yeah.
here you are. Well, cool. So I wanted to switch gears. Art Forum sent out this newsletter with, they've been doing this. I don't know how long they've been doing this, but they like release an article from their archives and then make it available online for about 7 days. And this week, the one that they featured was called The Loser Thing by Rhonda Lieberman on the art of failure.
Yeah.
And it was written in 1993, and it was all about how artists at the time were turning away from the idea of like the masterpiece. Like they're no longer even interested in making that as an artist, and they're now like seeking to reflect the crumbling society around them. She wrote, exploring the richness of student loan debt, credit card debt, masturbation, bloated ambition, and enforced downward mobility as a substantive fiber of their work. Which I'm like, this could have literally been written in my diary this morning, you know, like that.
Yeah.
And then add to that like climate crisis and, you know, PTSD from COVID. So
Yeah. It was, yes. And then like, yeah, pandemic.
yeah, and you know, various other things. But so I guess I wanted to kind of like bring up the idea, not only your thoughts on the article, if you have any, but the idea of the word like masterpiece, which I never really felt like connected to my work. Like it was never a goal. It never felt like a word that I really understood. It like wasn't for me, you know?
Yeah.
And it felt so subjective and like it only applied to certain people. And, you know, like I just never connected with it as a word. And
Yeah.
I don't know if that's because we grew up in the 90s when that whole era was about like the loser, you know, Beck
Yeah.
and Nirvana and like,
Yeah.
you know, accepting of the failure as like kind of like something to elevate. But is that just me, or did you feel like you had a different take on that?
Um, not, I feel similar in that like I never really connected with the word masterpiece. Um, but I guess I feel like I always really connected with the idea of like making ambitious paintings,
Mm,
and like never really connected with like the idea or the aesthetic of provisional painting either.
mm. Yeah, right. Like, because in our talk before the talk, we were
Yeah.
kind of, I was like referencing like things that came out of this like
Yeah.
loser low art movement, which you could argue it was, you know, the unmonumental show at the New Museum, provisional painting, you know, the current trend in work that's really about like the everyday,
Yeah.
and just kind of people sitting around or like referencing, you know, in this article, they talk a lot about pop culture.
Yeah.
But I think that has like been so far removed from, because it's transformed so much by social media. But
Yeah.
this idea that like celebrities and pop cultural, you know, entities are really showing their like failures or their, you know, but I think now we just see it as like
Just like,
real. It's
yeah.
like not even
There's
a failure anymore.
yeah, I guess, yeah, I mean, I guess like that's where the like, I guess that's where the like the article felt dated to me, was just
Yeah.
that like the social media has transformed the way that we see each other and like celebrity and everything so much that, yeah, I guess the idea of failure isn't even like, um
Like we're swimming in it. So
yeah,
it's hard to see it,
yeah, yeah, and
you know?
it doesn't feel like novel to point a finger at it anymore or like make a big
Yeah.
show about it in that way where it might have in the 90s.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Yeah, and I think the word failure has now taken on different like subtext. It's more about like being critical of the structure rather than
Like,
like not living up to something, you know? It's
yeah,
like
or
just
making it
blatantly
like,
critical.
yeah, or making it very um
One
like
like the idea,
personal and like self-reflective in a way.
yeah, like self-care comes up when I'm
Yeah.
thinking about it, you know, this idea and like the nap ministry. Have you heard about that?
No, I mean, I feel like
Uh,
I've heard of it, but I don't know what it is.
they're like on Instagram, but I think they've just written a book and they kind of based on Instagram, they always post images or videos of like, you know, high profile figures saying like, I'm gonna step back from work and take a nap. Like the
Oh,
idea of stepping back from like extreme success or whatever in order to like just get more downtime. And
yeah,
you know, I think Brene Brown talked about that a lot with her
yeah,
shame
yeah,
work. So I feel like we've in some ways come a long way for the good because yeah, the word failure isn't even really part of the conversation anymore,
yeah, yeah.
other
Um,
than systems failing us, not like we're failures. Whereas I think maybe the 90s people were
yeah, yeah, no,
incredibly,
I think yes, absolutely. But I do think like, like you mentioned before, all those sort of like art movements that came out of that, that became a very sort of like, um, the aesthetic sort of seeped into visual culture
yeah.
in a way. Um,
Yeah, like I think like provisional painting was all about kind of is it done, is it not done kind of, right? Like you didn't have to
yeah,
finish something in a way that like was markedly noticed, like you knew that it was done or
yeah,
that it was like finished in a more traditional like material sense.
yeah, and I guess for me that just like as a painter in the studio, that just like making work like that, because there's always the moment where you make something and you're like, oh, it looks so beautiful as it is now, like maybe I shouldn't touch it, but that also like feels really boring to me. It's like, well, then what is there to do in
Right,
the
like
studio?
the effortlessness
Yeah, I
that
mean, I guess
everyone
for
kind of
me,
achieves.
yeah, I guess for
Yeah.
me, like part of the like part of the fun, and like, or not even fun, like the interesting part is like pushing it, and the struggle, and the
Mm,
like, not struggle, that feels like, but like the turmoil and all of the sort of like unknowing that comes up over the course of making a painting is like really, it's like it's really interesting, and for me that's like where like the root, like that's kind of what
yeah.
drives me to the studio.
Yeah, I wonder if it was because I'm trying to remember the context of what it came out of. And there was a period before that that was really heavy into like, you know, Photoshop was really new. So things were being really
Yeah,
stylized and like
yeah,
overworked or not
yes,
overworked, but like really rendered. And so I
yeah,
wonder if like the pendulum swung and we had like zombie abstraction and then provisional painting on the other end as a
yeah,
refusal to like get so into this like digitized looking painting.
yeah,
Maybe, but yeah, I get what you're saying. I think if that is your practice, like great, that
yeah,
would
I
feel
mean nothing, yeah,
authentic, but
yeah,
like for me that isn't necessarily enough either.
yeah,
Like
yeah,
I don't know.
I mean, and it's not to say like I don't like those paintings, because there's plenty that like, yes, a lot of those paintings I
We're
find
really
like other people
delicious.
interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
Just like for me as like a way to make work, like I need I need more, yeah, I need more. I like really just like work in a painting.
And like, do you feel like trying to connect this back to your work that is somewhat influenced by motherhood and like I don't know if like you would say that the rectangle of a canvas like failed you during your experience as a mother, but like there is something lacking in that it did not reflect your lived experience of transforming. So
Yeah.
I don't know, like I'm just thinking like there is something about this idea of like reflecting the failure of systems in work that is still kind of carried through. And I feel like you're shifting of the, and some artists call it queering, or there's a lot of ways to approach that, but I do feel like you kind of deconstructed the like tradition of the rectangle and like dismantled it a little by going into this like shaped canvas to reflect your
Yeah.
personal, female mom,
Yeah.
experience.
Yeah. I mean,
Not to put
thank
that
you.
on.
Thank you. No, thank you. I'll take that. I mean, I think also just like for me to kind of like further that, I think like the way that I think about like layering a painting is that you're sort of like it's kind of amazing that you can like simultaneously like change everything while building on what's already there. Um
Yeah.
and
Mm.
that you could kind of like embrace all the failures and like it's like at the same time you could say like fuck it and still work with it at the
Mm-hmm.
same way. um
Yeah. Yeah, they're just paintings. I think that's one of the cool things about paintings is they're just paintings, and you can wipe them out, you can paint
yeah,
over them, you can like cut them out.
yeah.
Yeah.
um
Did your work connect to time at all? Like, how do you relate in terms of layering? Like, does that connect to like the time? Like, I know that that can be a language for some artists, like the layering and the time they put in, and
um ye- not, I wouldn't say time specifically, but like they are very layered, and I do like I c- I think about them more in terms of layers than I do in terms of time.
mm,
And that like every sort of like past layer is important to the overall like structure of the piece. And there's really like once I get to the end result, there's like nothing that could have really been like removed and for it still to work. So it's kind
yeah.
of like it needed all of that, like all of the past layers or like the past time to have existed in order for like this thing to exist.
I see what you mean. And because you
Yeah.
kind of will show marks by like covering them
Yeah.
over them, but like maybe not fully, or so like you'll
Yeah.
kind
And
of
that
show
like I
your
also
past
couldn't have like
work.
gotten to the place that I was without all of
Yeah.
the other layers, that it's somehow like the image created itself through the process of making it. And if I hadn't
Mm,
gone through that process, I wouldn't have landed up with that image.
yeah. And
Yeah.
you like want to show that. Like there's no
Yeah.
like kind of
Yeah.
concealing the effort, whereas some
Yeah. I mean, and
artists like do that.
I mean, I think sometimes it shows more than others. And I'm like,
Sure.
I think in some ways I show less of the sort of like the underlayers than I used to. Uh,
Mm,
I think that used to be more important to me to kind of show past layers. And now I'm like more selective. Like it started to feel more like I was being too precious about the
mm,
past layers. And now it's more like they're there and they're part of it, like whether you see it or not. And maybe it's like more subtle, like the texture of the piece, or like,
yeah.
yeah, like maybe it's more through texture or more it's just like I know that they're there and they are
Yeah.
like,
That is always a mystery. Like when you see someone's painting and it's got all this like heavy brushwork, but then it's been painted over and you're just like, what was that?
yeah, yeah. And I think
Like,
that's one
what
of
were
the
you doing?
things I think that's like one of the things that like happens, like because on like the screen my paintings look like kind of like really flat and crisp,
Yeah.
and in person there's
Yeah,
actually like kind of like a lot of like painted over brushwork and like a lot of texture,
totally.
and they're like a little gunkier than
Yeah.
I think people expect.
Expect.
So yeah,
Yeah.
and I like that sort of like push and pull.
When you don't tape off your edges, right?
No, I don't tape off my edges, so they do have like kind of like a just a
Which I
hair.
feel like that's a real camp. Like you're either on the
Yeah.
tape side or you're not. And I've
Yeah.
kind of been in both camps
Yeah.
before. And like, I just think, and actually like Joanne Greenbaum, I had her at SFAI for like an intensive.
Yeah, she's
I
not a
was
taper.
going on about this type of thing, and she goes, they're just marks, like whatever you choose, they're just marks. You can use them in whatever way you want, but just know the language and what you're saying through them.
Yeah.
But there's no like yes or no or good or bad,
Yeah, and like you could change your mind and
Yeah.
do it, taper,
In
not
the
taper.
middle of the painting, if you
Yeah,
want.
exactly. Yeah. But I don't tape at the moment, nor have I ever. But
Yeah, I was gonna say that I feel like you're a pretty firm
I'm
anti-taper. That's
yeah.
fair. Well, maybe talk a little bit about, you're going to be showing with Denny Gallery in New York. Maybe
Yeah.
talk about that process of connecting with them, and then like what the work is for the show.
Yeah, I have an upcoming show at Denny and I'm very excited about it. I met them in 2000 and I think 2016, the first year that Untitled came to San Francisco.
The
In
peak.
in the moment of in the moment of process the moment of promise in San Francisco. Yeah, and I just was looking at their booth and I think just asking some questions about the work and the director at the time who was at the booth, we started talking and I mentioned that I was at the Minnesota Street Project Studios and he asked if I would be interested in a studio visit because he had been hearing about Minnesota Street Project and wanted to check it out. So
Yeah.
I was like, yeah, sure. Although like I've never really heard of like galleries wanting to do studio visits like when they're there at a fair. But anyways, late
Oh, they
like
totally do that,
yeah,
but
really.
at the time, maybe.
Yeah, I feel like people are always like, oh, it's so busy with like crazy fair stuff.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, but maybe, yeah. Anyways, so we ended up doing a studio visit and it went it went really well and we were sort of in contact and they ended up taking a few paintings of mine on consignment. Like I sent them out afterwards and then that was kind of that. um and like I tried to keep the relationship warm over the years.
And how do you do that? Like, how did you do that, if you don't mind sharing?
Yeah,
How does one keep a
it's a good question.
long distance
I
gallery
guess
relationship warm?
when if I had a show in San Francisco, just like sending like the installation images of my show, just like sending a nice email being like, oh, I have this show, like would love to share these images with you. Um, hope you enjoy like showing them images without like asking for anything. If I was in New York, saying I was planning to stop by the gallery and seeing if like they would be around just to like say hi.
Yeah.
Once Zoom sort of started happening, like at one point I like was like, I have a new body of work, would love to, do a Zoom studio visit if that's something you're interested in. And um, it never really worked out, but
Yeah.
um, yeah. And then randomly a month or so ago, Elizabeth, who's the owner and the director now of the gallery, like asked me for a Zoom studio visit and it
Amazing.
felt like really out of the blue. And we, yeah, so we had a studio visit and it went really well and but was nothing conclusive. And then I was kind of like, oh, maybe it'll be like another 6 years until like
Totally.
yeah.
You're like, bye forever.
Yeah. And then she called me like a few days later and was like, well, I was going to schedule you for, wanted to talk about scheduling you for a show like a year out, but there was an artist whose work wasn't ready for the show. Would you be interested in doing a show in what was then 7 weeks?
Oh, yeah. And were
Yeah.
you pretty much ready? Did you have enough work?
Yeah. So I did have the work.
And so I think that's like a really good lesson, is like
Yeah.
having that like available archive of work ready to go,
Yeah.
like
I
for
kind of feel like
opportunities.
I've used this line before, like, I'm always ready for a solo show, and I almost feel like it's like my sleazy, like, pickup line,
Oh,
like,
hey,
"I'm
I
ready
love
for a
that.
solo show." Like, it almost feels gross, like, I can't use it anymore, but it has, like, actually served me well, like, several
Yeah,
times in my life. Not necessarily that line, but, like,
no, but
having a
the
body of work
idea.
ready rather than, like, the idea of a show, but being like, "Look, I have, like, 10 paintings here," like,
Yeah.
um, and they're done.
No, I think that's a great rule of thumb is like
Yeah,
have enough work. And if you like sold out your entire studio and just continued to do so, then like kudos to you for
yeah,
sure. But like I do think there's something too about preserving your work, even if you do have that demand in
yeah,
anticipation that like something might come up
yeah,
or,
totally. I
you
mean,
know,
and it was amazing that there was, like, this opportunity to, like, make the body of work for it, but I also, like, really kind of firmly believe in just, like, or for me, just, like, making the work
yeah,
whether or not I have something that's, like, on the horizon, because I also feel like when I'm really excited about the work that's going on in my studio, like, that's when I'm gonna be, like, reaching out to people, and that's, like, when I'm gonna, like, try and
yeah.
make things happen, and that's when I'm gonna be, like, presenting my work
And it
in
goes
that
back to
light.
like not chasing,
Yeah,
like not chasing that you did with the salon. Like
yeah,
you're creating that own energy for yourself and you're just like
yeah,
inviting people in instead of this, like, I don't even have the work, but like someone give me validation,
yeah, totally. It feels much better to me to be like, "Yeah, I have a kick-ass body of, like, paintings in my studio, like, wanna come check them out," you
Yeah,
know?
like you need me as much as I need you.
Yeah.
So yeah,
Yeah, and it was funny, like, when Elizabeth called me to offer me the show, I was just kind of like, "But, like, there's not," I was, like, trying to do the math in my mind. I'm like, "There's not enough time for me to, like, make new work and for it to dry and ship it out, and, like, what do you like, does she not, like, understand, like, how,"
great.
and
I
she
mean,
goes,
that
"No, no,
is
I
kind
mean,
of
like, the
wild.
work that, like, you showed me in your studio, like, that looked great, like, let's do the show with that."
Wow.
Um, which was like, "Oh, okay," like, and I had always kind of imagined making like, for my first show in New York, like, making a
Yeah.
new body of work, like, specific for that gallery or specific for that space, whatever it was, but so at first I was a little bit, like, nervous that it hadn't necessarily been, like, made for that space, but then when I kind of sat with it a little bit, I was like, "Oh, these works actually," like, I mean, of course, like, they were all made in conversation with one another, and
Yeah.
really, like, I mean, it was a show, so it
Yeah,
just
I love that.
yeah,
I think there is the impetus to always make the new thing,
yeah,
when you're given a new opportunity or just the shiny new object syndrome, like the
yeah,
newest is the best. But
yeah,
I think that was the universe being like, take a load off,
yeah,
you're good enough.
I think so, yeah, and it was just kind of like the work that you have now, like, deserves to be seen and needs to be seen, and, like, you'll
Yeah.
make new work that will be seen too, but, like, this work right now is, like, it just kind of all kinda converged.
And when does the show open and how long is it up for?
It opens, the 31st, so
Oh,
next
cool.
Friday, and it'll be up through May 6th.
Oh, great. Awesome.
Yeah, and
Yay. Are you doing
I'm
any
going out.
programming or anything?
Um, we don't have any there's, like, the opening on Friday, and then I'll be doing walkthroughs that Saturday,
Oh, cool.
that following Saturday, and then maybe that Tuesday as well too, because 'cause I'll be in New York
Okay.
through Tuesday.
Awesome. Well, this
Yeah.
is so great. I know we have like at least one or two new people since we started. Are there any questions? You can just put it in the chat. I'll give like a couple of seconds to allow for that. This is currently a live talk, but if you're listening to it, it's probably no longer live and on Spotify or Apple Podcasts or something. But um, all right, well, cool. Well, thank you so much, Rebecca. This
Thank
was
you.
so wonderful.
This is the first podcast I've ever done.
Oh, really? Oh
Yeah,
my God. Amazing. Well, it is my honor and
and
pleasure.
it was so much fun.
Well, thank you
Thanks,
and
Sarah.
have a good one.
You too. Bye.
Bye.